Lake Oroville at 91% capacity on Thursday. The water levels are rising, and the DWR is starting to make more water releases.
Concrete slabs in the spillway at Oroville Dam failed during releases from the floodgates, starting a chain of events that prompted the evacuation of nearly 200,000 people downstream.
Lake Oroville in California, the lifeline for tens of millions of people, was known for its near-collapse crisis in 2017. But that story is nothing compared to what is happening right now. Overnight, the lake's surface suddenly surged 23 feet, a massive influx of 7 billion gallons of water. While strange, cold bubbles endlessly rose from its depths. The immediate question is, where is this water pouring from? What is waking up beneath one of the world's largest dams? And could this deadly silence be the warning of a disaster far more terrifying than a crack in the concrete? The impossible event. In the Golden Hills of Northern California sits Lake Oroville, a massive and calm body of fresh water held back by the tallest dam in the United States. This is not just any lake. It is the heart of the California State Water Project, a huge system that provides drinking water for 27 million people and water for the farms that feed much of the country. For decades, its operation was a predictable science, with engineers watching computers that measured every drop of water coming in and going out, ensuring everything was safe and stable. But on one perfectly clear and sunny morning, the men and women in the control room saw something that made no sense, a number on their screens that simply could not be real. The computers showed that the water level in the giant lake was rising very quickly. And it did not stop until it had risen an incredible 23 feet in just a matter of hours. This was not a small change. It represented an addition of more than 7 billion gallons of water, a volume so large that it was difficult to even imagine. The first and most obvious thought was that a massive rainstorm must have happened somewhere upstream. The engineers immediately checked the data from every weather station managed by NOAA, the official government agency for weather. They looked at the entire Feather River watershed, which is the total area of land where rain would collect and flow down into the lake. The data was absolute and clear. There had not been a single drop of rain in that entire area for the past 72 hours. The next logical conclusion was that the sensors had to be broken, that this was simply a computer mistake. So they checked everything. They looked at the primary digital sensors, the backup sensors, and even old-fashioned physical markers on the dam itself. Every single system, all working independently, confirmed the same impossible fact. The water was really there. The lake was truly 23 feet deeper than it was just a few hours before. This strange event was a puzzle that broke all the known rules of hydrology, the science that studies how water moves. With no equipment failure and no rain from the sky, a terrifying question hung in the air. If the water did not come from above, then where in the world did it come from? Eliminating the obvious, the engineers at the DWR, which is the Department of Water Resources for California, immediately began a frantic investigation to find the source of the new water. They had to work fast because a sudden change in a giant lake could be a warning sign for a much bigger danger. Their first logical step was to check the other large reservoirs that exist higher up in the river system, like Lake Almanor and Butte Valley. It was possible that the operators of those dams had performed an emergency release of water for some reason, sending a massive wave downstream into Lake Oroville. The engineers made urgent phone calls and checked every computer log. But the records were clear. No large amounts of water had been released from any of the upstream dams. That possible explanation was not the answer. Next, they considered a more dramatic possibility: an underwater landslide. They thought that maybe a huge section of a cliff or hillside along the edge of the lake had broken off and collapsed into the water. An event of that size would push the water level up very quickly, much like a person getting into a bathtub makes the water rise. To check for this, They used powerful satellite imaging to compare pictures of the shoreline from before and after the event, looking for any sign of a collapse. They also reviewed data from seismic sensors, which are very sensitive machines that detect vibrations in the earth. But there was no record of a large landslide. With that idea also proven wrong, they checked the most basic sources, which are the rivers and streams that flow into the lake every day. The gauges that measure this flow showed that everything was normal and stable. Every logical door had been closed, after eliminating every possible source from the sky and from the land around the lake. The investigators had to turn their eyes toward the only direction that was left, a direction no one wanted to consider, which was deep down, under the solid rock at the bottom of the lake. The heart of California is skipping a beat. This strange event at Lake Oroville was not just a local problem or a scientific puzzle. It was a potential crisis for the entire state and even the country. To understand the enormous danger, you must first understand that Lake Oroville is the most important part of California's massive water system. It is the largest and most critical reservoir in the State Water Project, which is a huge, statewide network of canals, pipes, and pumping stations designed to move water from the wetter northern part of California to the much drier and more populated southern part. This system is the lifeline that keeps the modern state of California running every single day. The water stored behind the Oroville Dam provides drinking water for over 27 million people, which is more than half of the state's population. It also provides the irrigation water needed for the vast farms in California's Central Valley, the region that grows a huge percentage of the fruits, vegetables, and nuts for the entire United States. On top of that, the dam is a major source of clean energy, using the power of falling water to generate hydroelectricity that helps power homes and businesses. Because it is so important for so many things, any instability or serious problem at this one location could create a terrible chain reaction, a domino effect that could impact everything from the price of food in supermarkets to the availability of drinking water in major cities like Los Angeles. A few years before, California nearly lost this essential resource because of a problem they could see. But now, it was being threatened by something completely invisible: the ghost of 2017 and the invisible fear. The mystery of the rising water brought back a very recent and very powerful memory of fear for everyone in Northern California. This was because in 2017, the Oroville Dam was the center of a major international news story when it almost failed completely. During a season of very heavy rains, the main spillway, which is a giant concrete chute designed to safely release extra water, suddenly broke apart. A massive hole appeared in the concrete, and the rushing water began to destroy the hillside beneath it. The situation became so dangerous that authorities feared an entire wall of the emergency spillway might collapse, which would send a 30-foot wall of water into the towns below. This fear led to the sudden and chaotic evacuation of 188,000 people who had to flee their homes with little warning. That crisis was a problem that engineers could see and touch. It was a physical hole in a concrete structure. And even though it was a terrible situation, they knew what the enemy was. It was a fight against time, erosion, and failing concrete. But this new problem was completely different. This time, there were no visible cracks in the dam. There was no concrete breaking apart. And there was no roar of destructive water. This new threat was silent. It was a quiet, unexplainable change happening deep within the lake itself. And for many people, the silence of this new danger was much scarier than the loud noise of the crisis before. Because you cannot begin to fight an enemy that you cannot even see or identify. The first clue from the scene, with all the easy explanations failing. The Department of Water Resources decided they needed to send people out to see the lake with their own eyes. They organized survey teams, which included geologists who are experts in rock and earth, to travel by boat to the most remote and hard-to-reach parts of the lake's long shoreline. These teams were looking for any physical clues that the remote sensors and satellites might have missed, like large cracks in the ground, areas where the Earth seemed soft or sunken, or any other sign that could explain where billions of gallons of water came from. For several days they searched and explored, but they found absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. The land was solid, and the shoreline looked exactly as it always had. Then, in a few small, quiet bays on the far eastern side of the lake, one of the survey teams finally found something. It was not a landslide or a crack, it was something much stranger. The surface of the water in these specific areas was fizzing with countless tiny bubbles, almost like a giant glass of soda water. The first thought was that it must be methane gas, a common gas that is released when old plants and leaves decay on the bottom of a lake. But as they got closer, they knew this was not methane. The bubbles had no smell at all. Unlike methane, which often has a swampy odor, even more bizarre, the air just above the bubbling water felt noticeably cold. This was not the result of rotting plants. This was the first piece of real, physical proof that something was happening not in the lake, but deep down in the geological layers of the Earth far below it. The signal from deep Earth. While the water experts and geologists were stuck without any answers, the real breakthrough in the case came from a completely different scientific field. Far away, in an office in Pasadena, a seismologist, who is a scientist that studies earthquakes, was working for the USGS, the United States Geological Survey. The USGS is the government agency responsible for monitoring the ground all across the country for any shaking or movement. This scientist was not directly involved with the Oroville investigation, but he heard the news about the mysterious rising water and became curious on his own. He decided to look at the data from the network of extremely sensitive seismic stations that were positioned in the ground all around the Oroville area. He rewound the digital records, looking at the precise moment in time just before the lake level started to rise. At first, he saw nothing, just the normal, quiet background vibrations of the planet. But then, using a special computer program to look for very weak signals, he found it. It was a detail that everyone else had missed because it was so small. The data showed a tight cluster, or a small group, of micro-earthquakes, which are earthquakes so tiny that no human could possibly feel them. They had a magnitude of only 0.4 to 0.8, which is hundreds of times too weak to be noticed. The incredible part was their location and their timing. They all happened at the exact same time, in a location deep in the bedrock directly underneath the lake. And they happened just 90 minutes before the water began to rise. This was not a coincidence. The ground itself had trembled just before the lake transformed. And now the question was no longer just, where did the water come from? But, what did that tiny earthquake open? The induced seismicity hypothesis. The discovery of the micro-earthquakes was the key that unlocked the first logical scientific theory for what was happening. And it pointed to a strange but very real phenomenon. This idea is known as reservoir-induced seismicity, which is a scientific term that means earthquakes caused by a man-made lake. The explanation is actually quite simple. The water in a huge lake like Oroville is incredibly heavy, weighing many billions of tons. All of this weight pushes down on the Earth's crust, the solid rock that forms the bottom of the lake, creating an enormous amount of constant pressure. Now, the rock under the ground is not one perfect, solid piece. Instead, it is full of cracks and fractures known as fault lines. These fault lines are places where large pieces of the Earth's crust meet. The incredible pressure from the water above can, over time, force its way down into these deep fault lines. This water acts like a lubricant between the two sides of the fault, reducing the friction that normally holds the giant pieces of rock in place and prevents them from moving. If the pressure becomes great enough, It can make the fault slippery enough for the rocks to suddenly shift or slip just a small amount. That sudden slip is an earthquake. So the scientists formed a powerful new hypothesis. The lake itself, made heavier by a recent rainy season, had created just enough pressure to trigger its own earthquake. But this explanation, as shocking as it was, led to an even more important question. If the lake could create an earthquake, what could that earthquake do back to the lake? The forgotten aquifer, with the earthquake as their main clue. The geologists turned their investigation to a special kind of map called a hydrogeological map. These maps are not like road maps. Instead, they show where large amounts of water are stored deep underground in layers of rock and sand called aquifers, which are like huge, natural underground reservoirs. The scientists looked at the old maps for the area below Oroville and quickly found that the lake sits on top of a part of the Sacramento Valley aquifer system, which is a very large and well-understood source of underground water for farming. But the old geological surveys also showed something else, a much deeper and older system of aquifers that were completely separate from the ones near the surface. These deep aquifers were ancient, and they were described as being isolated, which meant they were trapped between thick layers of solid rock that did not allow water to escape, because they had been trapped for perhaps millions of years. They were under extreme pressure from the incredible weight of all the rock sitting on top of them. Then, the scientists did the most important step of the entire investigation. They took the precise location of the micro-earthquake cluster and placed it on the hydrogeological map. The location was a perfect and terrifying match. The cluster of tiny earthquakes had happened right over a section of rock that the maps described as a potential weak point between the bottom of the lake and one of these forgotten high-pressure aquifers. Suddenly, the full picture became clear. The hypothesis was now complete. The lake's weight caused an earthquake. The earthquake fractured the rock seal, and that fracture created a direct connection between the man-made reservoir on the surface and a massive, pressurized natural reservoir deep below. A huge exchange of water had begun. The warning from the wells. To show that this was not just a theory, the story of the investigation moves away from the scientists and their maps, and it now focuses on the real-world impact on the people who lived in the area. The story moves to an old farmer who lived in the foothills of the Sierra Mountains, just a few miles away from the lake. He was not a scientist, but he knew his land better than anyone. He told a strange story that on the very same night that the water in Lake Oroville began to rise, something unbelievable happened to the water well on his family's farm. This well had been a reliable source of water for over 50 years, never changing much from season to season. But on that one night, the water level in the well suddenly dropped by several feet, almost going dry. This one story from a farmer was interesting, but the scientists needed more proof. They got it by looking at the data from official monitoring wells, which are special wells that the government places all over the state to constantly measure the level and pressure of the underground water. The data from these scientific wells confirmed the farmer's story completely. All across the region, there was a sudden and unusual drop in the groundwater pressure at the exact same time the lake was rising. The scientists now understood that the entire underground water system was being changed. As the deep, high-pressure aquifer pushed its ancient water up into the lake, it created a low-pressure area, like an empty space, deep underground. To fill this space, water was being pulled down from the shallower aquifers all around it, which is why the farmer's well suddenly dropped. The event was not just happening in the lake. It was now clear that the entire plumbing of the region's hidden water was being rewired. The chemistry of the Ice Age. While the engineers and geologists were tracking the physical movement of the water, another group of scientists in a laboratory was working to discover its hidden identity. These scientists finally finished their detailed chemical analysis of the water samples that were collected from the strange, bubbling areas of the lake. The results were more amazing than anyone had expected. The first tests confirmed that the water contained no modern chemicals or industrial pollution, so it was not contaminated by any human activity, but it was far from normal drinking water. The tests showed that the water had an extremely high concentration of dissolved minerals, natural materials like silica and calcium that the water had absorbed from sitting against deep rocks for a very long time. The most important discovery, however, came from testing a special type of carbon that exists in the water. Scientists can study this special carbon to accurately determine the age of the water, telling them how long it has been since that water was last on the surface of the Earth. The conclusion from this test was stunning. The chemical fingerprint of the water proved that it was incredibly old. This was not water from a recent rainstorm, or even from 100 years ago. The evidence showed that this water had been trapped deep underground, completely isolated from the rest of the world, for tens of thousands of years. It was ancient water, likely from the time of the last great ice age. This meant the problem was now much bigger, because they were not just dealing with a massive amount of extra water. They were witnessing the reawakening of an ancient chemical system that could completely change the environment of the modern Feather River downstream. Fear and conspiracy. Theories. While the scientists were carefully working to understand the situation, the government officials in charge remained silent to the public. They did not want to cause a panic or release wrong information until they were 100% certain about what was happening. But this official silence created a huge empty space, and people who were scared and wanted answers quickly began to fill that space with their own ideas and theories. On local news websites and online community forums, discussions exploded as people tried to make sense of the impossible event happening in their own backyard. Some people asked if this could be connected to fracking, which is a method of shooting high-pressure liquid deep underground to break rocks and release oil and gas. And they wondered if a fracking operation somewhere else could have accidentally opened a path to the ancient water. Other people became very suspicious of the government itself, asking if the DWR knew about this dangerous deep aquifer all along and simply hid the information to avoid scaring the public. The most common and most frightening theory was about a much larger earthquake. Everyone in California knows they live in a place with major fault lines, and they feared that this strange event at the lake was a small warning sign, a foreshock, for a catastrophic earthquake that was about to happen on a major fault, in the empty space where scientific facts had not yet arrived. Fear grew very quickly, and sometimes the direct questions being asked by ordinary people were closer to the terrifying truth than what the scientists were yet willing to admit. Crisis at the water treatment plant. The effects of the ancient water did not stop at the edge of the lake, because the water eventually flows out of the dam and down the Feather River. And it was here that the crisis began to paralyze the essential systems of modern society. Far downstream from the dam, alarms began to sound inside the water treatment plants. These plants are like special factories that take water from the river and use a very advanced process to clean it, making it perfectly safe for people to drink in their homes. This new water coming from Lake Oroville was causing a huge problem for them. The problem was the very high level of dissolved minerals, the ancient silica and calcium that the water had absorbed from deep underground rocks. The most important part of a modern water treatment plant is its filtering system, which uses something called reverse osmosis membranes. These membranes are incredibly fine screens with holes so small that only pure water molecules can pass through, while everything else, like minerals or pollution, gets blocked. The ancient water was now sending huge amounts of these minerals into the plants, and it was quickly clogging up these very delicate and expensive filters. The plant operators had to make a difficult choice. Either they could keep running at full power and risk destroying their entire system, or they could slow everything down. They chose to reduce their power, which meant the factories were now producing much less clean drinking water than before. This created a deeply ironic situation. The state of California is famous for its droughts and for constantly worrying about having enough water. Now, it was suddenly facing a shortage of clean drinking water because it had too much of the wrong kind of water. This showed that all of our modern safety systems were built on the idea that the world is predictable. But when the planet itself changes the rules, even our most advanced technology can become useless. Summarizing the mystery, after all the investigation, the scientists and engineers could finally put all the strange clues together into a single, logical story. They now understood what had happened, and the truth was more incredible than any of the early theories. They knew for a fact that the lake had risen 23 feet with no rain. They now knew that the cause was a tiny, unfelt earthquake, a micro-earthquake that happened in the rock directly below the massive weight of the lake. They had a strong scientific reason to believe that the lake's own weight had caused this earthquake, a process called reservoir-induced seismicity. And they were now almost certain that this small earthquake had been just powerful enough to create a crack, a fracture, through the last layer of rock that was sealing off a deep and ancient aquifer. This explanation connected every single piece of evidence, from the rising water, to the cold bubbles, to the dropping wells of the local farmers. But even with this amazing scientific discovery, the most important and the most terrifying questions were still left unanswered. The first question was, how big was the fracture that connected the lake to the aquifer? Was it a small crack or a huge opening? The second question was even more critical. Was the fracture now healing itself and closing back up under the pressure? Or was the movement of water making it bigger and more unstable? And finally, the most important question of all was about the ancient aquifer itself. How much water was still down there? Had they just witnessed the release of a small pocket of ancient water that was now almost gone? Or was this just the first surge from a massive underground sea that had only just begun to empty itself into the lake above? They understood the mechanism that had been triggered, but they did not know if the event was over, or if this was just the beginning. The warning from the Earth's crust. The great mystery of Lake Oroville is ultimately not just a story about one specific dam, but it is a much larger story that serves as a powerful reminder for all of humanity. It is a reminder about the need for humility when we build our giant structures on the surface of a living planet. A planet that has its own ancient rules and its own immense power that we do not fully understand. Human beings, with all of our amazing technology and engineering skills, have learned how to control the flow of a river on the surface. But we have not learned how to control the powerful geological forces that are constantly at work in the planet's crust, deep beneath our feet. The strange event at Oroville is a clear warning that the massive structures we build can accidentally, and without our knowledge, interact with these deep forces, potentially waking up or activating natural powers that we can neither predict nor control. The dam is not just sitting on the land. It is talking to the deep rock below it. And we have only just now started to hear a small part of that dangerous conversation. This leads to the final and most unsettling question of all. We originally built the Great Oroville Dam to protect people from the disaster of a flooding river. But could it be that the dam itself is now becoming the trigger for a much larger and more terrifying disaster that is rising up from deep inside the Earth? That is the question that the mystery of Lake Oroville is now forcing the entire world to answer.